This video is about applying the properties of our squares, rectangle, rhombus. So before we get there, we're going to fill out our family tree to see how our shapes relate to each other. So as we move down the family tree, these shapes are going to get more and more properties. We're only going to focus right now on the center of our family tree. There are two other branches that we'll talk about later. So first, we have quadrilaterals. So quadrilaterals are all of our four-sided figures. Then we go down to parallelogram. So parallelogram is where we really start to get some of our properties that will help us when we are trying to solve problems because they have things like parallel sides, opposite sides are congruent, opposite angles are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, and the diagonals bisect each other. Then the diagonals split into two different directions, depending on if their angles are all 90 degrees or if their sides are all congruent. So we have a rectangle, which has the 90-degree angles, and we have a rhombus, which has those four congruent sides. Remember then, if we take those shapes and put them together, we create a square. So a square is going to have the most properties so far because it's taking properties from all of the shapes above. So let's complete the table of the properties so we know which ones have which properties. So have four sides. All of these shapes have four sides because they're all types of quadrilaterals. Both pairs of opposite sides are parallel. That's going to be a parallelogram, a rhombus, a rectangle, and a square. Both pairs of opposite sides are congruent is a parallelogram, rhombus, rectangle, and square. All sides are congruent. That is a rhombus and a square. All angles are congruent, which means that they're all going to be 90 degrees. That is a rectangle and a square. Opposite angles are congruent. That means opposite angles from corner to corner. So that's going to be, again, all four shapes, parallelogram, rhombus, rectangle, and square. Has a right angle. So the right angles go along with those congruent angles. So that is going to be, we skipped one. Consecutive angles are supplementary. That is all four shapes. Has a right angle. That is just the rectangle and the square. Remember, that's how they get their angles congruent. The diagonals are perpendicular is a rhombus and a square. The diagonals are congruent is a rectangle and a square. The diagonals bisect each other, though, is all four shapes. And diagonals bisect opposite angles. That is going to be a rhombus and a square. So let's use these properties to solve with. So first we want to find the missing angles in numbers 1 through 3. So in a rectangle, we know that at A, B, C, and D, they are 90-degree angles. And we know that the diagonals are all congruent, creating isosceles triangles. So the top and bottom triangle are going to have the same measure. So they're all going to have 31-degree angles at their corners, at their base angles. To get the other angle, then, that's where the 90 comes in. So we know that that whole corner has to be 90 degrees. So we can do 90 minus 31. And we get the other angles are 59 degrees. To get our last triangle angles in the middle, we can use the triangle and subtract the two angles from 180. So 180 minus 31, 31 is 118. And 180 minus 59 is 62 degrees. In a rhombus, we know that the diagonals are perpendicular and that the opposite angles are bisected. So all of the angles by A and C are going to be 37 degrees. To get our last angle, we can subtract 90 and 37 from both angles, from 180, so we get that the last angle is 53 degrees. In a square, we're never going to have any angles because they're always going to be the same. The diagonals are perpendicular, so those are going to be 90 degrees, and then in the corner, they're all 90 degrees, but the diagonals bisect them, so they're all going to be 45-degree angles. So a square is the only one that's always going to have the same type of angle measures. In number 4, TREK is a rectangle. Solve for X. Is it a square? So if it's a rectangle, right now that we know that rectangles have right angles. So we are going to use that part to solve first. So we know that K has to be a right angle. So 36X is equal to 90. we're going to ignore the sides for a second. So when we divide by 36, we get x equals 5 over 2, or we could say 2.5. Then we want to know, is it a square? So in order to be a square, the other part that we need to know is, does it have congruent sides? So I'm going to substitute my x in for the sides. So 8 times 5 over 2 plus 6 is 26. 6 times 5 over 2 plus 11 is 26. Those are the same measure, which means all four sides are going to be congruent. So is this a square? Yes, because it has a right angle and four congruent sides. Number 5, RHOM is a rhombus. Solve for x and y. So we know that angle RBH. So this angle here is 22x plus 2. We know that MRB, so this angle here is 3y plus 12. And RMB is 5y minus 26. So first, we know that the diagonals are perpendicular to solve for x. So we have 22x plus 2 is equal to 90. We get 22x equals 88. So x is 4. Then when we're solving for y, if we focus on this triangle here, we know that it is a right triangle. So we can add them all together to equal 90. So we have 3y plus 12 plus 5y minus 26 plus 90 is equal to 180. So when we combine like terms, 8y plus 76 equals 180. We can subtract 76 from 180. 8y equals 104. So y is 13. In number 6, we're going the opposite direction from number 4. So ABCD is a rhombus, which means that it has congruent sides. Is it a square? So we want to know, does it have a right angle then? So this time we're going to start with the sides. We know that the sides are congruent. So we're going to set those equal. 4x minus 3 equals 2x plus 7. We get 2x equals 10. So x is 5. Now that we know that, in order to figure out, is this a square, we got to know about our angle. Is our angle a right angle? So 14 times 5 plus 90, or plus 30, is 100 degrees. That's not a right angle. So no, this is not a square because no right angle. Number 7, SQUA is a square. Solve for x and y. So if it's a square, we know both things are true. The opposite sides are congruent. All sides are congruent. And we have a right angle. So we have 7x minus y equals 31. And 4x plus 6y equals 90. So in the first equation, I can multiply by 6. 42x minus 6y equals 186. And then we have 4x plus 6y is equal to 90. So we add straight down, we get 46x is equal to 276. So we get x is 6. Once we know x is 6, we can substitute. So 7 times 6 minus y equals 31. 42 minus y equals 31. Negative y is equal to negative 11. So y is positive 11. Name the quadrilaterals that have the following properties. Some properties apply to more than one quadrilateral. So which ones have consecutive sides that are perpendicular? So that means that they're going to create right angles because they're perpendicular. So the shapes with right angles are a rectangle and a square. The diagonals bisect each other. Well, that's a property from a parallelogram, so all of our special ones follow. So this is a parallelogram, rhombus, rectangle, and square. Diagonals are perpendicular. That is a rhombus and a square. Diagonals bisect opposite angles. Again, that's a rhombus and a square. Opposite sides are congruent, so that starts in a parallelogram, which gets them all. So this is a parallelogram, a rhombus, a rectangle, and a square. And our last one, all four sides are congruent, so that is in a rhombus and in a square. Sometimes, always, never. So these questions are not just straight true or false, they're sometimes, always, never, which means always is a true statement, it's always going to happen. Sometimes means that we can think of a case where it would or and wouldn't happen, and never means that this is not possible for that shape or for the statement. So in number 14, the diagonals of a rectangle bisect each other. Well, we get that from a property of a parallelogram, so this is always. An equilateral parallelogram is also equiangular. So equilateral parallelogram means that it's going to have four congruent sides. Does it always have to have four congruent angles? Well, in a rhombus, it's not going to have four congruent angles, so it's not going to be equiangular, but in a square, it would. So this is sometimes. The diagonals of a rhombus are congruent. Now, here's where we have to be careful. In a rhombus, that does not happen, but in a square, which is a special type of rhombus, this does happen. So this is a sometimes. There is one right angle in a parallelogram, and it is not a rectangle. Well, by definition, rectangles have a right angle, so this is going to be never. An equiangular rhombus is a square. That's true. We just talked about that in 15. So in 15, this means it's going to be equal sides and equal angles, so it has to be a square, so this is always. And the opposite of angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. Well, think about this. Supplementary means that they have to add up to 180, and that can happen if the opposite angles are 90, because that would make them congruent, which they're supposed to be as opposite angles, and supplementary, so that would be a sometimes.